So grateful for that. Well, today we are jumping back into our series entitled Make War. Look at somebody and say, make war. That was creepy. The rest of you, now, say it again. Look at somebody with some enthusiasm and say, make war. That's what we're talking about. We're looking at Paul's words, Paul's letter to the church at Ephesus, where he begins to talk about this idea of spiritual warfare and putting on the armor of God. And I want to encourage you this week at some point to read through the book of Ephesians. Take some time there, because a lot of times what happens is we get to a passage like this and it's just like, it's weird. It seems like we're getting into that kind of stuff that in the church we don't really want to talk, spiritual warfare and stuff. Here's what's interesting. If you read the book of Ephesians, you'll notice something. It's an extremely practical book. It's a book where you'll find how husbands should treat wives and wives should treat husbands. It's a book where you will find how children should obey their parents. Parents, that was your chance and you missed it. It's a book where we find how employees and employers should work together and how they should treat one another, how the church should treat one another. Very practical book. And a lot of times we get to chapter 6 and it feels like Paul is taking this hard left turn away from this practical, everyday kind of stuff to talk about things that we're just like, that's weird. What was going on with Paul? Here's what we need to understand. What Paul is trying to convey to us is that spiritual warfare is practical. It is everyday living. Just as important as it is for you to treat your spouse well, you need to be putting on the armor of God and know the purpose of the armor of God, why you have it and what its role is. So as you read through that, understand that Paul's still being very practical, but a lot of times we take those things like this that are hard to deal with and set them off to the side. So we're continuing on. Last week we talked about the belt of truth, how truth holds everything together. Pastor did a great job of unpacking that for us, and we saw how it is that truth keeps us from tripping up over our own lies, and how truth is central to who we are in Christ, how it holds all things together, the sword is hung on it, and that to know truth is to know Jesus Christ. So today we're going to continue in verse 15. We will return to 14 next week when Pastor returns to talk about the breastplate, but today we are in Ephesians 6:15. And it says this, "And with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace." Your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. So Pastor was not too excited about having to deal with the belt and how just, that is. I get to talk about shoes. And all the women said, exactly. Like half of you are like, this is going to be the best message ever. Feet fitted. So today we are talking about the feet. We're talking about this particular element of the armor of God, the shoes. And we're just going to try to pick this apart a little bit, just this one verse, and talk about it, discover together what it is that Paul's saying to us. And it's interesting to note that to start off, Paul says this, that our feet are to be fitted with the readiness that comes from the, what? The gospel. The gospel of peace. There's more there, and we're going to get to it. But the first thing that he says is, your feet are to be fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel. Now, we're a participatory church, so we want you to get involved here, all right? I'm going to read a few verses, and every time we hit the highlighted word, I want you just to shout it out, okay? So here's from Mark. It says this, "For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for me, for thee, will save it." Good job, guys. Here we go. Again in Mark. "And the must first be preached to all nations." Here we go to Romans. It says, "I am not ashamed of thee, because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes." And one more in Corinthians. "Yet when I preach I cannot boast, for I am compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the..." There it is. That word that we saw 5 times out of the hundreds that it appears in the New Testament, in the historical writings, the letters to the church. That word that we just read in the Greek is the word euangelion. It's where we get the word evangelism. You can kind of hear some similarities there. But the word literally translated, some of you have it in your translation of the Bible, literally translated, it means good news. In other words, the gospel is to be good news. Everybody say good news. Y'all are doing so good today. I'm excited. This is going to be good. Here we go. Good news. Now, here's the thing. Stick with me because this is going to get a little unnerving for a moment, okay? The focus of the evangelistic efforts of the church for far too long, the focus of our sharing the gospel has been to make people aware, sometimes painfully aware, of two things. First, their sin. We got to tell them they're sinners. They need to know. They're lost in their sin. They're wallowing in their sin. They're dirty, no good bags of garbage. 2, hell. That has been kind of the focus of evangelism for quite some time in the church. That we make sure that people know that they're sinners and where their final destination is going to be because of their sin nature or their sin behavior, that they're going to hell. Here's the problem with that. That's the very opposite of good news. I know, some of you, I feel you. I grew up in the church, and you've got that, we're going to lynch him when this is over. Okay, just hang with me for a second, all right? What we've been doing for far too long is focusing on the antithesis, the exact opposite of the good news. They need to know they're sinners. They need to know that they're going to hell. And here's the thing. I'm not denying that sin is a problem in our world. I think that we can turn on the news for 5 seconds and figure that out, right? And I certainly will not deny the reality of a very real destination called hell that is the eternal dwelling place of those who don't receive Christ. We need to say that in the church. We need to be clear on that in the church. There's not some place that you go and all dogs don't go to heaven. Some of them just go to hell. All right? I get that. But listen. That does not need to be the primary focus of what we're saying. People don't primarily need to hear that. What they need to hear is the alternative. They need to hear the good news. You can go up to them all you want and say, you're a sinner, chicken dinner, and it's not going to do a bit of good. But if you tell them what the good news is, they'll listen. How many of you ever had a teacher, whether it was elementary school or high school, junior high, maybe even college? How many of you ever had a teacher or professor that the thought crossed your mind, how did you get this job? Right? We are blessed at Upward Christian Fellowship to have some amazing educators who are the very hands and feet of Christ in our school systems, public schools, private schools. We have homeschool teachers. We are blessed with educators who are gifted at what they are doing. We are grateful for you, every single one of you. We want you to know that. But there's always one that you just kind of scratch your head and think to yourself, nope. I had one of those in high school. I had one in high school that taught math. And I will not say any more on the grounds that I may incriminate myself. But I had a teacher in math who was not good at teaching, period, much less math. And we would take a quiz or a test, and you would get your test back, and you would see all the red marks, and you would know exactly what you got wrong. But there was nothing showing you why you got it wrong or how to get it right. And my wife is a teacher, and my wife is great at this. I've actually been in her classroom as she's teaching before, and she'll tell the kids, hey guys, so a couple of you missed this one. This is why you missed it. This is the answer we were looking for, and this is how we get to the answer. This person did not do any of that at all. And here's the thing. That was the only class ever in my entire education, all the way up through college, that I ever got a C in. Yes, I'm a nerd. Leave me alone. The only class ever. But here's the thing. I got the C not because of my lack of desire to get the answer right. I got the C because the person who had the answer was more focused on telling me what I got wrong. And that is what has happened in the church. We become so focused on letting people know what they're getting wrong that we forget that we're supposed to be sharing the good news. And the good news is this right here. Listen, that we cannot view the gospel as a tool to point out the problem without realizing that the heart of the gospel was to reveal the solution. The heart of the gospel was to point us to Jesus Christ, the way, the truth, the life. It was not to say, that way is death, that way is destruction, that way is hell, that way is death, that way is... It was to say, He is the way, He is the truth, He is the life. It was to provide a solution and point people to that solution. And I know you say, Nate, that's hard. It's hard to talk about, Jesus Christ, because it gets uncomfortable and sometimes it's just weird. And just be honest, how many of you have ever had those moments where it was uncomfortable talking about Jesus and what He's done in your life? So 2 of you. Then this church will be huge by next Sunday. Well, let's try that again. How many of you have ever had an uncomfortable moment where you knew you were supposed to talk about Jesus and it just felt weird? Right. Let me challenge all of us, including myself, with this. Have you ever gotten a really good, juicy little tidbit of something? Yeah, y'all know what I'm talking about. Just a little gossip bug in the ear. And it was good. I mean, like really, really good. Did you hear what she did? Did you hear why he lost his job? I did. A little bit. And how many of you know that when that hits your ears, in the amount of time it takes to process in your brain, you're already thinking, I've got to tell somebody. I've got to share this. This is too good. You're like digging for your phone. We as humans, when we hear that, we want to share it. But let me just challenge you with this, okay? Why is it that we are so eager to share news that can destroy a person and so hesitant to share the news that could save them? Oh, y'all thought there was more to the funny story. Nope, that's it. Sorry. We are, as humans, we find it very easy. Listen, the gospel should be that compelling to us. The good news of what Jesus has done in my life should be as compelling and more so than the news that I heard that I can share with you about somebody else. When we leave from here today, we should be so on fire to say to somebody, I've got to share with you what I heard today. We will tweet and Facebook a picture of a steak, but not tell people the great thing that we heard as we were gathered together as the body of Christ that the world desperately needs to hear. And that's what it means to have our feet fitted with the gospel. But then he goes on, and Paul says this, having our feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of what? Peace. The gospel of peace. We talked a lot about peace during our series on worry and anxiety, and how peace is a promise to us, how peace is there to guard our hearts, how it's a gift from God to us. But look at this right here. These are the words of Jesus in John. It says this, peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. Now, what's interesting about those words is I think if we really focus on it, those aren't just words to serve as a statement of security for us. Hey, I have peace. My oldest is growing up on me right in front of my eyes. It was the most surreal experience to see him up here leading worship on the bass today because you don't see your kids growing up like that. But he's taking on a lot of new responsibilities. At home, I've told y'all before, he mows the grass now. That's why you have boys. It's true. He's gotten to where mom has gotten him doing his own laundry, which is fascinating. I'm like, praise God, that's exciting. He does his own laundry. He needs to. But he does a lot of things. He kind of cleans up around the house. He takes out the garbage when he remembers to. But one of the things that we'll often have him do is help out after dinner. When we're done with dinner, a lot of times Michelle and I will have to clean the dishes, wipe them off, because you got to wash dishes before you put them in the dishwasher. So we'll be doing all that, and we'll say, Bubba, will you go to the pantry and get the Oreos out from the he's before we finish the word Oreos. He's there, and he grabs them, and we're like, okay, good. Now, here's the thing. When we say that, the point of us sharing with him, hey, will you go get the Oreos, is not for him to grab the Oreos and sit down over top of them at the table like a teenager and inhale them. That's not the point. What we want is for him to grab the Oreos, bring them to the table, get a few out for himself, and then distribute those Oreos to his little brother and his little sister. Because here's the thing. He has that responsibility because he is now doing something I would normally do. Stick with me. My peace, I leave you. My peace, I give to you. What Jesus is saying here, again, is not a statement of security just for us. Yay, I have peace. It's a statement of stewardship. In other words, what Jesus is saying to us, what Paul is saying about being fitted with the gospel of peace, is we are not just heirs of his peace, we are now agents of his peace. Everywhere that we go, we should bring a spirit of resolve, of unity, of harmony. Where we go, the words we speak should encourage some sense of bringing the peace. James speaks of this in James chapter 3. He says these words. Have we got it? I'll read it over here. James says, and those who are peacemakers will plant seeds of peace and reap a harvest of righteousness. That's what we're called to be. People who bring peace wherever we go, to exhibit it, but to show others how they can experience it. But it's not just that. Notice that we couple the two of these. Somebody needs to catch their kid right there. They love you and they want to see you and give you hugs and kisses. He couples these two words. With your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. He doesn't have the gospel over here and peace over here. He puts the two together. The gospel of peace. Again, hang with me because some of you are going to get tense on this one. What Paul is trying to convey for us is this. The gospel, the good news, should never be an intentional point of contention. In other words, the gospel, the good news, is not there for you to win an argument. It's the good news of peace. When you share it, it should bring some sense of peace to the situation. We should not wield the gospel of Jesus Christ as our own personal weapon to rain down condemnation on others. And yet that's what we've done so often in the church. Christians who I'm sure are well-meaning, standing on street corners, preaching about darkness and sin and the patterns of this world and how broken we are, without ever remembering that it's the good news of peace. Starting fights, protesters holding up signs saying that God's not okay with what you do, John 3:16. Here's what's interesting. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his what? Only Son, that whoever believes in him should not, but have everlasting life. Here's what's funny. You can't read 16 and say, oh, I forgot about 17. Which says, for God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but rather to save it. Here's the thing. So many times in the Christian community, we tend to make war with the very people that we were sent on a rescue mission for. We tend to fight and point fingers with the very people that God has said, I want you to reach them with the good news of peace. And we somehow think that our words of condemnation will lead them to a place where they say, yeah, you know what, you're right. Now I know, some in this room, I get it, because I think this when I say that. Some of you are thinking, so what are you saying? You know, we water down the gospel? We go soft on sin? No. I think we need to have a clear understanding, a biblical understanding of sin and what God deems appropriate. And it's here. We don't get to argue with it. We don't get to change it. We don't get to say that just because there are cultural norms that are shifting, that somehow this is now different. It is the same yesterday, today, and forever. But I think that when it comes to dealing with those who have never heard the good news, Paul hits the nail on the head in the book of Colossians when he says this, let your conversation, now please understand, as Paul wrote these words to the church, just before this, what he is referring to is our interactions with those outside of the church. Okay? And he says, with those outside of the church, let your conversation be always full of grace and seasoned with salt, seasoned with truth, seasoned with the reality of where they are. Let your speech be full of grace and seasoned with salt. I've got a little breakfast treat. Now it's more like a lunch treat. How many of you in the room like hash browns? Anybody like hash browns? Yes. I love some good hash browns. These aren't great. These are just some that I whipped up this morning. But I like home fries better. Like, if you're not from the South, you don't understand the difference, and that's okay. Just if given the option between a hash brown and home fries, pick home fries. Okay? So I like some home fries. I like some hash browns. And I like just to, sprinkle a little salt on there just to give it some, just gobble that stuff up. It's good. I know that wasn't enough for some of you. I've eaten lunch with some of you. That's more like it, right? Just a touch. But then there's this option. Now, if given the option, all kidding aside, because I know there's always a jokester in every room, all kidding aside, if you're given the choice between this is A and this is B, how many of you want A for breakfast? And how many of you want B? Right? Like, unless you're a horse and you like licking salt. But listen, that is exactly what we've done. We bring good news, and then we dump the reality of who they are, where they are, what they're in, on top of good news. And so the thing that was appealing is no longer appealing because we put so much salt on it. But Nate, we're to be the salt of the world, right, seasoned. So for those who would say, oh, so what you're saying is we should water down the gospel. No, what I'm saying is ease off on the salt. Bring the gospel, bring the good news, full and real, but season it with the truth of where they are. Season it with what it is that they're going through. And it is in that we find that the very thing that God intended to draw all men to him does exactly that. The gospel only becomes unappealing when people get a hold of it. I didn't say that any other service, and that felt good, so I shall say it again. The gospel only becomes unappealing when people get a hold of it. We mess it up and we turn it into something that it was never supposed to be. Good news of peace. Because here's the thing. Good news without peace is neither good news or peace. Finally, we'll close out. He says this, and with your what? Feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. With your feet fitted, with your shoes on. He focuses in on the feet here, which I find extremely interesting because I have some personal experience with this one. When we're talking about the feet, how many of you are maybe a little bit accident prone in the room? You're a klutz, is what I'm getting at. I'm raising my hand not to encourage you, but because I am. I have prayed, Lord, deliver me from my klutzy nature, and he just keeps saying, my grace is sufficient for you. And it just, struggling with it. More so when I was younger, but listen, I have had all kinds of injuries. I think it's kind of the nature of our family, but I have broken both ankles, sprained them more times than I can count, broken all of my toes on multiple occasions. Now granted, I was an athlete, I did lots of active stuff, so that was a big part of it. I've blown this knee out twice. I've broken this arm twice, this elbow once. I've broken my hands. I've split my head open and fractured my skull. I've had stitches on 2 other occasions. Pretty much, I'm a klutz. That's okay. And I'm active. But the worst one ever. Well, here, let me show you a picture of it. No, don't worry, it's not gross. How many of you have heard of this right here, the plantar fascia? This is that bundle of tendons at your toes that come together as one through the arch of your foot and then connect to your heel. Well, if it's tight, if your plantar fascia is tight, you should really exercise a good bit to make sure that when you do anything athletic, you don't mess this up. Well, I have tight tendons. And if you're like me and 10 years ago you still think you're 18 and you play basketball with a bunch of guys that are 18 and you're trying to show off and be cool, one day you're running down the court and all of a sudden you feel something that sounds like a baseball bat smacking the bottom of your foot. And you stop. And you look around and say, "Ain't y'all hear that?" And they say no. And then you try to walk. And you can't. And so you go to the doctor, and like me, you sit in front of the doctor and he says, "Hey, we've got good news and we've got bad news. What do you want first?" Good news. I like good news. He said, "Well, the good news is you don't have to have surgery." Yes. Fantastic. What's the bad news? "Well, you don't have to have surgery because you did it yourself." I said, "What?" He said, typically, people who have a plantar fascia as messed up as yours, we have to go in and surgically cut that tendon to relieve the pressure so that it can then heal back with tissue and scar tissue so that you can walk normally again. But you've been walking kind of messed up for so long and playing sports that your body decided it was going to do the surgery on its own. And it hurt. And I couldn't walk for weeks. I couldn't stand. It threw me off. It was, please understand, it was just my foot. It was just the bottom of my foot. But I had no sense of balance because I couldn't use it. I had no sure footing. All because of my feet. Why does Paul point to the gospel of peace being connected to our feet? Because when our feet are fitted with the gospel of peace, we have a foundation on which we can find balance, on which we can find some sense of security. And here's what's amazing about this. Look, these are the shoes that a Roman soldier would wear. They're leather bound to protect their feet. They have leather laces to hold them on tightly. They have these metal studs all on the bottom. Why? To provide traction so that when the battle begins, they can stand with their feet firmly planted. That is the gospel of peace to you and to me, is that we might have something on which we can stand firmly planted when the battle begins. When culture all around us is changing and telling us what's right and what's wrong, we can stand on truth. Just like Paul to the leaders, the philosophical and religious leaders of the day in the book of Acts, when he says, "In him we live and move and have our being." That's what it means to have our feet fitted with the gospel, the good news of peace. And then finally he says this. He says we are to have our feet fitted with the readiness that comes when we willingly take on this piece of the armor, this component of the armor, and say, I will place my feet within the gospel of peace. What we are saying is there is a readiness and an understanding that our steps are no longer our own. They are guided by him. We are directed by him. We go where the good news of peace is needed. Whether it's down the hall or around the world, we go where the good news of peace is needed. Just like the prophet Isaiah, who said, whether you turn to the right or to the left, you will hear a voice in your ear saying, this is the way, walk in it. That's what it means to have our feet fitted with the good news of peace, ready at a moment's notice, seasoned with salt, to bring hope and life change to a world that so desperately needs to hear that message. Amen.